What is the historic anomaly of the 2020 Summer Olympic Games, modern Olympic Games? Well, that's an interesting question. It's not that it was held during a pandemic. You don't even have to go back 15 years to find the last Olympic Games that were held during a pandemic. The last Olympic Games, so if we're going, some people say, oh, it's because it was held during a pandemic. Wrong. If we're going based on reality and what has actually happened in the past, the last Olympic Games held, so I'm doing this as like on the Olympic Games scale. The last Olympic Games held during a global pandemic was the 2010 Winter Olympic Games in Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia, Canada, and it was held during the swine flu pandemic. So that is the last one. So the 2020 Summer Olympic Games were held during the COVID-19 pandemic. So 11 years later, maybe it's just a trend that's emerging, is more Olympic Games during pandemics, because 11 years between Olympic Games held during a pandemic isn't actually that, between global pandemics, it's not actually that long of a time gap. So, okay. So the Winter Olympic Games were held in 2010 during a pandemic. 2021, the 2020 Summer Olympic Games were held during a pandemic. That cancels out. On the purely base factual level of Olympic Games held during a pandemic, that the 2020 Summer Olympic Games are not unique in that sense. So what makes it a true anomaly? Well, I was thinking about it, I was like, I had friends who went to the 2010 Winter Olympic Games in Vancouver. I was living in Seattle, Washington State, so a little bit, 2-hour drive from where the Olympic Games were held. They still allowed attendees. So, okay, maybe it's a link, because that's a lot more rare in the Olympic Games. That's starting to get to anomaly level. So, okay, number of attendees. Attendees, like attendeeship, people who go to an Olympic Games, it's not always like super high. There are fluctuations in attendance. So, yeah, but a pandemic and restricting it so even family members from athletes can't go to the Olympic Games. So yeah, that reaches anomaly level, approaches anomaly level. And then thinking, so there, 2020 Summer Olympic Games, attendeeship, there was like nobody. But on its own, except for like athletes and workers and photographers and some journalists and stuff like that. So, I mean, attendeeship was not zero. There still were attendees, even if it was just like the athletes themselves or the coaches, that kind of thing. Workers, big one, workers, volunteers that make the Olympic Games happen in the first place. But I think the anomaly, and reflecting on it, it might actually be a financial one, because if you think of the amount of money that goes into spent in the 2020 Olympic Games were already kind of had an exorbitant double dollar sign price tag. So maybe that's what I should call this, is the historic double dollar sign anomaly of the 2020 Summer Olympics, or 2020 Summer Olympic Games, or something like that. Is if you have bare bones attendees, like no spectators or even family members are allowed at an Olympic Games, and it's one of the most exorbitant in terms of price tag for money invested in the construction of new venues and stuff like that, well then the price of the Olympic Games per attendee is going to be off the charts, because spectators weren't even allowed. So that already approaching anomaly status for lack of attendees and spectators, pure just spectators, taking that approaching anomaly and tying it with one of the most exorbitant price tags of an Olympic Games to date makes it like a standout anomaly, an outlier, only one to have the price per attendee what it was, because spectators weren't allowed and it was so expensive as a whole. And then paring that down, if we even wanted to play devil's advocate and say price per attendee for spectators, of which there were 0 because spectators, even family members, were not allowed, then that's off the charts. Infinite. Well, technically undefined. But yeah. So that's kind of, it's just kind of interesting. The true anomaly for the 2020 Summer Olympics, at least like the one that makes kind of sense, is the financial one and how exorbitant it was per person to attend the games.